What if the history you were taught wasn't the full story? What if deep beneath the headlines of World War II were secrets so disturbing, so carefully buried, that they were never meant to see the light? From forbidden technology to erased resistance movements, this isn't just a retelling of the war. This is what they didn't want you to know. In the winter of 1943, deep within the shadowed mountains of southern Germany, a secret project unlike any other was reaching its terrifying climax. The German nuclear weapons program, spearheaded by a cadre of scientists loyal to the Reich but driven by ambition, had succeeded where many had thought impossible. They had built the first atomic bomb. This moment changed the course of history forever. By the time the Allies prepared for their massive invasions across Europe and the Pacific, the Nazis had already unleashed their devastating weapon. On a cold December morning, a blinding flash lit the skies over London, the city's heart reduced to rubble in seconds. The shock waves reverberated across the globe. The world was no longer fighting a conventional war, it had entered an age of unimaginable destruction. Adolf Hitler, emboldened by this new power, declared a swift end to the conflict on his terms. "The war will end before the dawn of 1944, he boasted in a chilling broadcast to the German people. The Allies, stunned and scrambling to respond, faced an impossible dilemma. Britain, its capital devastated, was forced to reconsider its position. The United States, still recovering from the shock, hastened efforts to catch up in the nuclear arms race but faced grim realities on multiple fronts. The Nazis used the atomic bomb strategically to break the morale of both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. In Moscow, the news of the bomb's use on London sowed panic within Stalin's inner circle. Troops were recalled from the front lines to defend Soviet cities, and Stalin began urgent peace negotiations, wary of inviting nuclear devastation into his own lands. Operation Barbarossa, which had already stretched German forces thin, saw a sudden shift, from outright conquest to intimidation backed by a weapon no one else possessed. The documentary unravels the layers of this alternate timeline by drawing on declassified Nazi documents, testimonies of surviving scientists, and accounts from Allied spies who barely escaped the bomb's first deployment. It tells the story of Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist torn between his duty and conscience, who tried desperately to delay the weapon's completion, hoping for a chance to prevent the apocalypse he helped unleash. His internal conflict humanizes the monstrous technological achievement. As Germany consolidated its grip over much of Europe, the United States, initially reluctant to engage in a nuclear arms race, accelerated the Manhattan Project with renewed urgency. However, despite their efforts, the U.S. wouldn't test its own atomic bomb until late 1945, too late to counter the Nazis' earlier dominance. In this shadowed reality, the Axis powers negotiate from a position of unassailable strength. Britain, fractured and occupied in parts by German forces, enters an uneasy armistice. France remains under brutal occupation, and the Soviet Union, while never fully conquered, is forced into a humiliating peace treaty that cedes vast territories to the Reich. The war in the Pacific takes on an even more desperate tone. Japan, initially allied with Germany, hopes to leverage the Nazi nuclear breakthrough to solidify its own ambitions. But the atomic bomb's power remains tightly controlled by Berlin, causing friction between the Axis partners. Japan's push through Southeast Asia slows as the United States, mobilizing under the threat of annihilation, pours massive resources into conventional and nuclear research. This story also examines the long-term geopolitical consequences. With Nazi Germany's empire expanding and its ideological grip tightening, the post-war world never experiences the United Nations or the international human rights movement in the same form. The Holocaust, chillingly amplified by the regime's dominance, continues longer and with even greater horrors due to the lack of intervention. Meanwhile, a cold underground resistance grows among scientists and civilians within Germany itself, determined to undermine the regime from within. This secret network eventually passes critical information to the Allies, hoping to ignite a final stand against tyranny. But with the bomb already detonated and fear reigning supreme, their efforts are a desperate gamble against an almost invincible enemy. The documentary's final segment speculates on the fragile balance of power in this world. Would the Nazis maintain control indefinitely with their nuclear advantage? or would the inherent instability of such a violent empire lead to internal collapse? Historians debate whether the atomic bomb in Nazi hands ultimately accelerated the war's end or prolonged humanity's darkest chapter. Interviews with experts paint a haunting picture, a world where science's greatest achievement became a tool of terror, where alliances shifted not only by force of arms but by the terror of nuclear annihilation. This scenario poses an unsettling question. How close was the world to this terrifying reality, and what lessons from this hypothetical past still resonate today? In the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, aiming to crush the Soviet Union swiftly and decisively. In our history, the campaign devastated much of the USSR before stalling. But what if the invasion had failed utterly within the first weeks? What if the Red Army had repelled the Wehrmacht so decisively that the entire Axis plan unraveled immediately? This alternate timeline begins with a shocking Soviet counteroffensive that caught the German forces unprepared and fractured their spearheads. Instead of rapid advances, the Wehrmacht was bogged down in fierce, organized resistance, compounded by devastating logistical failures and brutal Russian winter conditions arriving early. The Soviet commanders, having anticipated the attack through intelligence breakthroughs, launched a preemptive strike on key German supply lines and flanks, turning the tide before the Germans could consolidate their gains. The documentary traces how this catastrophic failure shattered German morale and sowed chaos in the highest ranks of the Nazi command. Adolf Hitler, known for his obsession with quick victories, lashed out against his generals in fury and paranoia. German troops, exposed and encircled, suffered massive casualties, with entire panzer divisions annihilated in battles near Smolensk and Minsk. The dream of rapid conquest dissolved into a desperate fight for survival. With the Wehrmacht in disarray, Stalin seized the moment to rally his nation. The Soviet propaganda machine broadcast stories of heroic victories, strengthening the resolve of millions. This early success also galvanized the Communist Party's control over war strategy, pushing aside more cautious voices who had feared collapse. The Soviet war machine shifted into overdrive, reorganizing and reinforcing fronts while pushing back into territories formerly occupied by the Nazis. The documentary interviews former Red Army veterans who describe how morale soared in those first months, turning despair into determination. Soviet forces were no longer fighting a defensive war but spearheading counteroffensives deep into Eastern Europe by the winter of 1941. The Battle of Moscow, instead of being a near catastrophe, became a symbolic Soviet victory that accelerated the collapse of German forces in the East. This early Soviet success had dramatic ripple effects on the broader war. With the German focus divided, the blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered France and the Low Countries lost their momentum. The Allies in the West found themselves fighting a Germany weakened not only by fronts but by internal dissent and resource shortages. Britain, buoyed by news of Soviet resilience, intensified collaboration with Moscow, sending more supplies through Arctic convoys and reinforcing the Eastern Front. The documentary explores how this shift altered the nature of the alliance between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. With the USSR firmly on the offensive, Western powers felt more confident pushing for a two-front assault in Europe, hastening plans for the D-Day invasion. The Axis powers, meanwhile, were forced into defensive postures, scrambling to hold onto key territories. Inside Germany, the failed invasion sparked political turmoil. Opposition groups, previously suppressed, sensed cracks in Hitler's regime and sought to exploit the chaos. The documentary delves into clandestine meetings of military officers and political dissidents plotting coups that could have brought an earlier end to the Nazi reign, though such attempts were fraught with danger and betrayal. As the Soviet armies pushed westward, they liberated Poland and other occupied nations sooner than in actual history. The earlier collapse of the Eastern Front forced Germany to withdraw from the Balkans and parts of France to reinforce its defenses. This domino effect shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years, with VE Day arriving as early as 1944 in this alternate reality. The documentary also examines the consequences for the Holocaust and civilian populations. With the Nazis losing control faster, many concentration camps were liberated sooner, saving countless lives. Resistance movements in occupied countries gained strength from the shifting tides, launching more coordinated sabotage efforts against Axis supply chains. Globally, the Axis alliance suffered irreparable damage. Japan, observing Germany's faltering fortunes, reconsidered its own expansionist plans in Asia, fearing the loss of their powerful European partner. The United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor but witnessing the Soviet success, doubled its support for the Allies, coordinating massive Lend-Lease shipments and preparing for a Pacific offensive earlier than in our timeline. Historians featured in the documentary debate how this complete failure of Operation Barbarossa rewrote not just military history but the entire geopolitical landscape. The Soviet Union, emerging from the war stronger and with greater territorial gains, shaped the post-war world differently. Instead of a tense Cold War standoff, some experts speculate that a more cooperative Europe could have developed, with the Soviet Union integrating more closely into global diplomacy instead of retreating into isolationism. Yet, the documentary also warns of darker possibilities. A Soviet Union emboldened by early victories might have exerted even harsher control over Eastern Europe, accelerating the onset of authoritarian regimes and limiting political freedoms far more than occurred historically. The line between liberation and occupation blurred in the eyes of many. In the end, the film presents a complex picture, a failed Operation Barbarossa that saved millions of lives by hastening the Nazi defeat, but that also set the stage for a very different post-war reality, one defined by shifting alliances, accelerated conflicts, and a world forever changed by one battle that never went as planned. June 6, 1944, the day the world remembers as the turning point of World War II, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the liberation of Western Europe. But what if that day had turned into a nightmare, a total disaster that changed the course of the war and altered history forever? In this alternate timeline, weather conditions worsened unexpectedly just before dawn. The crucial timing of the landing craft was thrown off, making the amphibious assault chaotic and disorganized. German defenses, instead of being caught off guard, were fully prepared, reinforced by last-minute intelligence that revealed Allied plans. The Atlantic Wall fortifications were manned with greater numbers, artillery was precisely targeted, and machine gun nests were fully operational. The documentary opens with harrowing accounts from fictional survivors of the failed landings, describing waves of soldiers cut down as they struggled to reach the shore. The water churned with debris and panic as Allied troops were pinned against cliffs and barbed wire, unable to establish a foothold. Communications broke down rapidly, and the hoped-for airborne landings behind enemy lines faltered amid confusion and enemy fire. Within hours, the Allied beachheads had collapsed. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. Commanders, both British and American, scrambled desperately to regroup, but the German counterattacks were swift and brutal. Panzer divisions, previously held in reserve, were unleashed, surrounding the survivors and pushing them back into the English Channel. The dream of opening a Western front to relieve the Soviet pressure in the East evaporated overnight. Back in London and Washington, shock and disbelief rippled through military and political leadership. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill faced the grim reality that the Second Front might never materialize, forcing the Allies to rethink their entire strategy. The documentary shows tense war rooms and urgent conferences, revealing the cracks appearing within the Allied coalition as frustration mounted. With the failure of D-Day, the war in Europe stagnated. The Nazis, energized by their decisive victory, intensified their brutal occupation across France and the Low Countries. Resistance networks faced harsher crackdowns and lost critical support from the outside world. The documentary includes chilling narratives from fictional resistance fighters who describe the tightening grip of the Gestapo and the destruction of safe houses. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union bore the full brunt of the fight against Germany alone. Without the promised pressure from the West, Soviet forces faced even fiercer battles, with higher casualties and slower advances. Stalin's trust in his allies wavered, leading to increased suspicion and demands for post-war control that further strained relations. In this timeline, the Holocaust's horror deepened. With Nazi power unchallenged in Western Europe, deportations accelerated, and extermination camps continued to operate at full capacity without interruption. The documentary draws on survivor testimonies and secret Allied reports revealing the scale of atrocities that could not be stopped without a successful invasion. The documentary also investigates how the failure affected public morale on both sides. In Allied countries, war weariness increased. Anti-war movements gained strength, questioning the human cost of a conflict with no clear end in sight. In the United States, political pressure mounted to limit military involvement, with some advocating for negotiated peace even with the Axis powers. In Germany, the victory at Normandy became a propaganda triumph. Hitler used the event to strengthen his regime, rallying the population around a renewed vision of victory. But cracks beneath the surface grew as the prolonged war drained resources and morale. The documentary explores the internal dissent within the Nazi high command, including secret plots and resistance from within. As months turned into years, the war dragged on, consuming millions more lives. The eventual Allied victory, delayed until 1946 or beyond, came at a staggering cost. Europe lay in ruins, more devastated than in our reality, and the geopolitical landscape was deeply altered. The Soviet Union, bitter and exhausted, occupied far more of Central and Western Europe, setting the stage for a harsher Cold War divided by deeper mistrust. The documentary closes with reflections on the thin margin between triumph and disaster. How close was the real D-Day to total failure? What lessons can be learned about preparation, intelligence, and the unpredictability of war? It offers a sobering meditation on courage and sacrifice amid the chaos of a battle that might have been the darkest chapter in human history. In the shadowed depths of World War II, amid the horrors unfolding across Europe, a secret coalition of unlikely heroes emerged. Scientists, diplomats, underground fighters, and even some within the Nazi ranks, who risked everything to expose and stop the machinery of the Holocaust before it reached its full, devastating scale. This is the story of a world where genocide was averted through courage, espionage, and extraordinary collaboration. The documentary begins in early 1942, when rumors of mass exterminations in the East began to seep into the intelligence channels of the Allied powers and certain pockets of German dissenters. Unlike in our reality, this alternate history imagines a clandestine network called the Phoenix Group, made up of Allied spies, resistance leaders from occupied nations, and disillusioned German officers who refused to turn a blind eye. Through their efforts, detailed evidence of the atrocities was smuggled out of concentration camps and broadcast to the world. The Phoenix Group's operatives managed to intercept and decode secret orders, secretly filmed camps, and relay testimonies from survivors and prisoners risking their lives to speak out. This explosive information reached the highest levels of the Allied governments far earlier than in our timeline. Faced with undeniable proof of systematic mass murder, Allied leaders prioritized humanitarian intervention alongside military strategy. Instead of solely focusing on defeating Germany through conventional warfare, coordinated efforts began to target the infrastructure of the genocide itself. Special operations were launched to sabotage railway lines transporting victims to camps, disrupt supply chains, and liberate key camps in daring raids. Within Nazi Germany, the Phoenix Group also planted seeds of doubt and resistance among officers and bureaucrats complicit in the crimes. Some high-ranking officials, horrified by what they witnessed, covertly provided information or helped sabotage operations from within. This internal dissent fragmented the Nazi war machine, weakening its capacity to maintain the genocide on a massive scale. The documentary recounts the harrowing stories of individuals like Friedrich Adler, a fictional German scientist who risked execution to leak blueprints of gas chamber technology to the Allies, and Sofia Kowalska, a Polish resistance leader who orchestrated successful attacks on trains heading to Auschwitz. Their bravery reshaped the trajectory of the war and the fate of millions. As the Phoenix Group's efforts intensified, public awareness in Allied countries grew. Pressure mounted on governments to act decisively, leading to international condemnation and unprecedented coordinated bombing campaigns on camp facilities, forced labor sites, and transport hubs, a controversial strategy that saved lives by disrupting the Nazi killing machine, but also caused tragic collateral damage. The early liberation of concentration camps meant that many prisoners survived, including those whose fates were sealed in our reality. Survivor testimonies included in the documentary show how families were reunited and lives rebuilt, as well as the lasting trauma of those who endured the ordeal but escaped the final horrors. The documentary also explores the political ramifications of preventing the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials, while still held, focused more on dismantling the Nazi regime's military and political leadership than on prosecuting the scale of genocide that might have otherwise taken place. The moral reckoning of the world shifted toward rebuilding and reconciliation, though the scars of war and oppression remained deep. Historians interviewed speculate on how this altered timeline influenced the development of human rights law and international cooperation. The prevention of the Holocaust became a rallying point for global unity, inspiring the creation of stronger frameworks to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity before they could escalate. The United Nations' early formation was driven by this collective determination to never again allow such atrocities. However, the documentary also presents a nuanced view, acknowledging the immense complexity of such a scenario. The Phoenix Group's existence required extraordinary trust and coordination in a time of fear and suspicion, and the moral dilemmas faced by those deciding between military objectives and humanitarian interventions were profound. In closing, this alternate history story honors the countless real-life heroes who fought the Nazi regime in every way they could. It poses a haunting question: how many lives might have been saved if such a resistance had existed in reality? The film invites reflection on courage, hope, and the power of collective action against overwhelming evil. December 7, 1941, the day that, in our history, thrust the United States fully into World War II after the devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But what if Japan had never launched that surprise strike? What if diplomatic tensions, internal debates, or strategic caution had led Tokyo to hold back from attacking the American naval base? This is the story of a world where the Pacific War took a vastly different path. In this alternate timeline, the Japanese military leadership, divided and cautious, decides against provoking the United States directly. Instead, they focus on expanding influence through diplomacy and limited military actions elsewhere in Asia, wary that a direct conflict with the U.S. could jeopardize their broader ambitions. This choice sets in motion a complex chain of events with far-reaching consequences. The documentary opens with an overview of the tense negotiations between Japan and the U.S., where economic sanctions and embargoes on oil and steel had created a powder keg. Without the immediate spark of Pearl Harbor, talks drag on through late 1941 and into early 1942, with neither side willing to concede critical demands. Japan continues its campaigns in China and Southeast Asia but avoids open war with Western colonies or American forces. Meanwhile, the United States remains officially neutral but increases military readiness in the Pacific. The Roosevelt administration, sensing the threat of Japanese expansion but unwilling to enter a costly war without provocation, ramps up production of warships, aircraft, and training. The documentary features interviews with military historians who analyze how this buildup shifted U.S. strategy toward deterrence and defense rather than outright confrontation. The absence of the Pearl Harbor attack significantly delays America's entry into World War II. Instead of a sudden mobilization fueled by outrage and loss, the U.S. pursues a cautious path, strengthening alliances with Britain, Australia, and China while preparing for a potential conflict that may come but is not yet declared. For Japan, this cautious approach allows more calculated territorial expansion in Southeast Asia. However, the lack of a decisive blow against the U.S. Pacific Fleet means American naval power remains intact, maintaining control over critical sea lanes and forcing Japan to confront a well-prepared adversary. The documentary explores how this changed balance of power affects battles across the Pacific. Without the initial chaos and destruction at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy is better positioned to challenge Japanese advances early on. Key battles like Midway and Guadalcanal play out differently, with Japan unable to secure quick dominance. Domestically, the absence of Pearl Harbor shifts American public opinion. Isolationist sentiments remain stronger for longer, complicating President Roosevelt's efforts to pass wartime legislation. The draft and military spending grow incrementally rather than explosively, leading to a more measured mobilization. In Asia, Japanese control over occupied territories is more tenuous without the distraction of a full-scale war. With the U.S. resistance movements gain strength, and the Allies coordinate more effective countermeasures. China's prolonged struggle against Japanese occupation sees more international support, and British and Dutch colonies hold out longer. The documentary also speculates on the broader consequences for the European theater. Without America's immediate involvement in the Pacific, resources and attention are more concentrated on defeating Nazi Germany. The timing of D-Day and the end of the war in Europe shift accordingly. As tensions simmer without boiling over, the world enters a prolonged period of uneasy peace punctuated by skirmishes, espionage, and proxy conflicts in Asia and the Pacific. The Cold War, when it finally emerges, takes a different shape, one in which the US and Japan are wary adversaries rather than outright enemies. The film closes by reflecting on the fragile nature of history and how one decision, one withheld strike, reshaped the trajectory of global conflict. It reminds us that war is often decided not just by battles fought, but by those avoided. The absence of Pearl Harbor delayed a world war but did not prevent it. Instead, it transformed it. Some truths are too dark for textbooks. Some stories were silenced, not by time, but by design. What if the most terrifying parts of World War II never made it into the history books? You've opened the box. Now you can't unsee what's inside.